Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. And tonight I'm going to be talking about why it is that it's quite often people who are religious who are responsible for some of the worst acts against other human beings that we've seen throughout history, up until the very present day. So why is that? It seems like the ultimate contradiction, given that religious people are supposed to be an example of holiness for the rest of the world. And I'm going to drill into exactly why it is that this contradiction emerges. If you think about the whole history of the Crusades, of the Inquisition, the pogroms in Russia, even the history of colonization and the reasons and the justifications for that, it seems like the very worst atrocities of one human being against another, the very worst crimes on a mass scale of one human being against another, are done by religious people and have a religious justification behind them. That's not to say the worst atrocities of one person against another were committed by religious people. I think that communism in the 20th century certainly takes the first prize when it comes to the sheer number of lives that it has destroyed in the name of a belief system. And of course, a certain political party that took control of Germany in the 30s also has its fair share of crimes that can be chalked up to it. But quite often we see that it is religious kind of belief systems that are the driving force behind this. There would be some people that argue that communism is itself a religion. Usually it's new atheists who are trying to argue that it's always religion that leads to the atrocity of one person against another, which is not quite accurate, as I'll explain tonight. Interestingly, they're not so quick to say that new atheism is a religion, even though it fits many of the same criteria that they attribute to communism as a reason why that can be considered a religious movement. But I digress. But there's something that ideologies like communism have in common with religious zealotry as it's traditionally understood through history, and many of the reasons why religion can turn into this force, from a force for doing righteousness and doing good in the world into a force for just unleashing mayhem on the human race, much the same across both types of belief system. But the reason why we notice more so than usual, apart from how heinous the crimes are and how extreme they are, the reason why we notice when religious people in particular commit these kinds of horrendous acts against other human beings is because it stirs a special kind of outrage in us, because of the fact that religious people are supposed to be more righteous than the rest of the population. And they are in fact exhibiting traits of the very opposite of that, behaving as though they are the very worst of people among the human race, to the point where there's a growing number of people who think that the world would be better off without religion at all. It's the outrageousness of this hypocrisy and the extremity of this hypocrisy that really grabs our attention. How do we explain this hypocrisy among religious leaders or religious zealots? How do we explain this supreme contradiction? To be frank, oftentimes it is simply just a matter of being a wolf in sheep's clothing. A lot of religious people are, very, very good-natured, drawn to religion because they want to strive towards the good, and that means that they can also want to see the good in the other person, in their neighbour, which is the way that they should be if they're really following that path correctly. But this can lead them to be very trusting of other people, particularly people who belong also to a religious group that supposedly has those values, and particularly to somebody in a position of authority in such a community. And so if you're a narcissist or a sociopath, and you really want to find a group of people to control and exploit, one of the most effective things you can do, and one of the groups that is the most ripe for the picking, if you have that mentality, is a religious group. And so you have these really wicked people, like many of the televangelists in the United States, who reinvent themselves as religious leaders and become pastors and become preachers and become leaders of a flock in order to manipulate and control them and spread their own particular brand of venom throughout the rest of society. But it's really about predating on other people and seeing an opening, seeing an opportunity to do that. So that can often be the case. Why we have so many religious leaders who act so despicably, because it's always about being a predator towards other human beings. Being a holy figure, an authority figure with a sense of holiness is really a convenient cover for people who have a really rotten heart. And so that's one of the reasons why it's often the religious leaders that perpetrate the most evil in the world. But there are also a lot of ministers, a lot of pastors, a lot of religious leaders who do at their core have good intentions, I feel. A lot of people speaking about their devotion to Christ and fighting the good fight against the forces of evil, the forces of darkness in society. And a lot of these people are really sincere, and they identify an evil that is real. It comes from the heart, and it's a genuine, heartfelt desire for justice in the world, and it is motivated by a genuine spirit of righteousness. But then you'll see these same religious people turn around in the next sentence and say, 1 billion people on earth, like every single person who lives in India is a devil worshipper because the Hindu gods are demons, and then they're all going to go to hell because of that. Too bad. It's just, and you just wonder, where did that come from? Like, what is this? Or this person from this other Christian denomination has a slightly different doctrinal view to me, so they're a heretic and they're doctrinally wrong and biblically wrong, and therefore they're the worst person ever. Like, the most petty kind of disagreement gets inflated into this cosmic battle against evil. And that is the kind of intolerant mentality that ultimately leads to awful things being committed in the world on a historic scale. And so I want to tell you what I think the underlying reasons for that really are. The first thing is dogmatism. How am I defining dogmatism here? Well, I think you can define dogmatism as when you take an intellectual belief system, an intellectual ideology based on a person or a group of people's opinion, and then you elevate that to the level of absolute truth and objective truth. That is what dogmatism really is. I'm not a postmodernist. I don't think that there's no such thing as absolute truth and that everything's relative and anything goes and up can be down if you just believe it. I think that there is an absolute truth, but there is only one thing which can be regarded as absolute truth. It's the divine. God, if you will, is the only absolute truth. Everything else is only relatively true. Not just in the domain of human knowledge, but in the domain of physical existence. Anything where there is a separation between one thing and another, anything where there is a limited boundary between one thing and everything else, is the beginning of relativity and relativism, and it's the beginning of illusion. And in God, all is one. So anything that exists in the physical sense, in the sense of the phenomenal reality that we live in, is by definition relative. Everything reduces down to a set of dualities. The Taoists understood this well. And so everything is relative. Anything that is part of a duality is only relative. Its qualities are only defined relative to its opposite polarity. And so that is the kind of programming language of the universe. This dualistic, relativistic kind of language that describes the reality that we know. And so then we observe everything and we construct a model of the world in our heads based on that. And of course, we're only ever going to be given a small part of the picture because we only encompass a small part of the picture. And so any belief system that we have can only ever be relative. And I understand, the objection to postmodernism, which says that, there's so much relativity that everything is meaningless. I don't prescribe to that. I think that there's degrees of relativity, and I think that there are certain things which are more absolutely true than others. They're not purely absolute, but they are certainly more absolute or more universally applicable than others. For example, if I want to donate blood, if I were a universal donor, that would be to say having O negative blood, then I would be able to give to any person and it would be a successful transfusion. But if you're not a universal donor, if you've got one of the other blood types, you can't give to anybody. So you can't say that because everything's relative, a universal donor is the same as someone who's not a universal donor. If you have that level of relativism, people are not going to survive basic medical procedures. So it is very important to understand that there are things that are universals for all intents and purposes, but there's always a limit to that, unless you're talking about pure divinity. And it takes humility to admit that you don't have all the answers and you can't possibly have all the answers because you are human, because you are imperfect. But religious people who fall into being dogmatists lack that humility. And the reason they are able to justify it to themselves are because recognizing that God is the only true source of truth, they say, unlike all of these other false doctrines, my doctrine comes directly from God. That's why it's absolutely true. So this is a claim to have access to revealed knowledge. All you need to do to recognize that claiming that revealed knowledge is absolute truth is a load of hogwash is to just look at the fact that there are different religions across the world which claim to have revealed knowledge directly from God, which contradict each other. So unless God is like James McAvoy's character, or characters I should say, in the movie Split, I think something different is going on here. If you've seen my videos on Enochian magic and my experiences with that, I talk about what it's like to receive divine revelation, because there's actually rituals from the Western esoteric tradition that you can do to kind of have an experience of divine revelation. And you don't get absolute truth. Everything that comes from the divine in the form of revelation must touch the human vessel through which it is transmitted. And the moment divine knowledge touches the human vessel, it is immediately contaminated. There is just no way that you can have pure revelation. Even revealed knowledge is relative because it is ultimately filtered through and gains some of the some of the flavour of the individual, of the mind, of the psychology that it is moving through. It's like when fresh water flows through all of the pipes that we have that are full of, calcified metal and fluoride and all of that, and you can taste the difference when it comes out the tap the other end, unless you have a purifier. It's like drinking pool water, because the pure water is contaminated by the vessel through which it moves. It's the same with divine revelation. So I would say even claims to divine revelation do not entitle somebody to say that they have access to absolute truth. But religious people do, because again, that train of thought never enters their head because they lack the humility to even countenance the idea that they might be wrong. And so what happens when you have a situation where people say, I have the one right answer to everything. I have a complete belief system which explains everything that there is to know, and it can never change. And then what if somebody also believes the same thing? They believe that there was some mistake that was made somewhere along the line, and they come up with their own version, and then you've got two competing versions of absolute truth, where there's just absolutely no way that those two belief systems can compromise with one another. It's a zero-sum game. They have to fight until one of them annihilates the other. There is no other way to resolve that kind of conflict between two rigid systems. If they had been humble and they had said, well, we acknowledge that we can't fully understand the divine mystery, and we can get pretty close by looking at the writings of people who have been divinely inspired and the works of great theologians that interpreted that afterwards. But we can't have the whole truth, and so we need to admit that we might be wrong about some things. If you have that attitude, then you can have a situation where people are debating with each other, having perhaps robust debate, but being able to compromise, being able to be more tolerant towards each other, and ultimately being able to find some kind of common ground or some sort of synthesis of their views which represent a more sophisticated understanding of the mystery of divinity. But you can't do that if you think that you already have all the answers. And it also means that you can't tolerate dissent, which leads to authoritarian forms of leadership, which in themselves are a great source of many of the world's evils. And another thing that makes dogmatism so dangerous is the way that it's able to allow a person to abrogate their moral culpability, their moral responsibility for doing terrible things. They can simply say, oh, well, I really don't want to do this, but the Holy Book says that, no person who is like this shall be allowed to live, so I have to follow God's laws. And so, they do the deed, but they're only following God's will, so that allows them to, it allows that act of evil to be more palatable. It's the old, I was just following orders kind of an argument. Being complacent and being complicit and relying too heavily on appeals to authority instead of using your own reasoning, your own critical thought, and your own conscience to decide whether something feels right or wrong. And that is another danger of dogmatism. It can atrophy our ability to think critically and rationally and make us just unthinking followers. And again, we see the parallels in something like communism or Marxism or radical leftism. Like they joke in The Life of Brian about splitters and, the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front. And that really is what it's like on the radical left, because everybody thinks they have the one right ideology that explains everything in existence, and everybody else is wrong, and ultimately needs to be forced to accept the truth. So it's the same old thing, and then you have the same rigid ideology that everyone's expected to conform to, which leads to a system of oppression. It's exactly the same phenomenon, and this kind of proves that it's not so much to do with religiosity as it is to do with the human intellect and the pride of the human intellect, thinking that it can make itself like God and be all-knowing. It's really the negation of true religion, of true spirituality, when you see this sort of thing being done in the name of religion. But it is quite often religion that does it because religion seems to have the most valid claim to many people, to having this absolute truth, having access to that. A lot of this has to do with spiritual pride as well. I'd say that's probably the other big reason for religious people behaving badly, you might say. I want to explain, it's kind of related to what I've spoken about already, but I just want to explain a bit more about the personal attitude of spiritual pride. So people that are in a religion are particularly susceptible to the sin of pride. And the reason why is because when we're in a religious setting, when we're in a spiritual setting, what we're doing is we are looking for holiness. We are looking for that which is sacred. And what does it mean to consider something as sacred? It means to set it apart from everything else, to make it special, put it on a pedestal as above everything else in value and importance. That's what we're doing to God, to divinity, when we are being spiritual, and that is where divinity should be in our hierarchy of value. But what can happen is that through the ego and through the personality interfering with that process of wonder and awe for the divine and worship of the divine, we can attribute that same value to things that it doesn't belong to. In particular, what we can do is we can personalize our experience of the sacred. We relate the sacred back to ourselves so that we are somehow holy, and we take ownership, we try and possess and own holiness. Then suddenly it's, we are the chosen ones, we're special, we're not like other people, we're holy because, we're virtuous and upright and upstanding, and we're just different from other people, and in fact we're better than other people because of this spiritual community that we belong to, and because of these beliefs that we hold. And the moment you have redefined somebody as lesser, as inferior in some way, you've dehumanized them. And then if somebody is not fully human, the same rules of dignity and respect that apply to the real humans don't apply to this group that you consider below you. And so it doesn't take much to see how that can become the justification for all sorts of terrible things being done. And so that's when pride creeps in, because pride wants to set itself above other people. Rather than seeing all people as being inherently human and having the same spark of the divine and having the same inherent dignity just by virtue of being human beings, we want to create hierarchies and say, well, your life has more value because of X, Y, and Z than that person over there. And pride can often do this in terms of money, in terms of what suburb you live in, what school you go to, what job you have, what you look like, any number of things. But in the case of spiritual pride, people do that with their religion and their religious identity. This is the classic holier-than-thou attitude. The correct way to relate to divinity is not to try and have ownership over it, but to participate in it selflessly, without any agenda, just simply abiding in the presence of the divine and being completely open to it and surrendering yourself to it, not trying to make the divine conform to make it fit with what you think you deserve and what you think you should have. But that's what people suffering from spiritual pride do. They shut themselves off from really receiving wisdom from the divine, and they choose to believe instead in a fantasy, which is that they're special, God wants them to be prosperous, and it's all about that person and their needs and them succeeding in life, quite often at the expense of other people, in the case of religious conflicts. And then, it becomes about them and not about God and not about the divine, because they're not giving anything up. They think that they're entitled to everything because of their holiness, as though that's how holiness works, as though that's how grace works. But we cling so desperately to things that are of the world, and we don't want to let them go, and so we block our ears from the true voice of the divine, and we convince ourselves that the voice in our head is really God, when it's really just the ego. And it tells us things that we want to hear about who we should be and what we should get and how much better we are than other people. And we say it's because of our righteousness, it's because of our godliness, and that's spiritual pride. And it really feeds the ego, this idea of being special because of God's favour. So ironically, what it's doing is, in the very environment where you should be trying to get rid of the ego and to lessen the ego and learn humility and learn to really listen to God, you're instead strengthening it. It's the ultimate irony. And the third big reason why I think it's often religious people who are the ones who are doing these awful things to the rest of the human race is because religion can give a justification to acts of wickedness. You might think of holy wars as an example of this, or some other kind of act of intolerance, of being hurtful towards another person in the name of spreading the truth. But this is what people do. They use religion as a justification for really terrible things that they do. Somebody might be doing something which really does have the seed of goodness behind it, but the means that they use to achieve that end up causing harm to another person. A more modern example of this might be, the Christian kind of street preacher type who will go out the front of a Planned Parenthood clinic and harass the women that are going in there. I mean, regardless of what you think of the ethics of what's going on there, which is not the point that I'm highlighting, regardless of whether you think that's right or wrong, there are women going into that place who are going through one of the most, unpleasant times in their life. You've got some dude harassing them and making it worse and making them more distressed. And so, and they, in any other situation, like if they were walking out of a funeral and you were harassing them and telling them that their relatives were burning in hell. I mean, maybe if you're from the Westboro Baptist Church, you think that that's okay, but most normal people would think that that's sick behaviour. But because there's suddenly a religious justification for it, suddenly you can do something really horrible to another human being and ignore the horrific act and have not enough conscience and conscientiousness and self-reflection to see the horrific act that you are doing. It doesn't matter in your mind what the scale of sin is, whether one is worse than the other. The fact is, you're doing something wicked. And it doesn't matter if your justification is religious. It's still wicked. But if you don't have that spirit of self-reflection, if you're so focused on the other person's sin and the other person's flaws that you can't see your own, then that's how you can get situations where people use a religious justification for really awful types of action. And again, because we have this moniker of religiosity, because we can say that what we're doing is in the name of God, then that becomes a cover, that becomes an excuse to not think that we need to use our discernment to scrutinize that particular type of action that we engage in to see if it's right or wrong. Quite often, though, a religious justification is used to try and justify things that are just unspeakable, unthinkable acts of evil. I mean, obviously, we don't need to look very far in the world today to see examples of that unfolding before our very eyes in the news cycles. But, you know, there's examples all through history of this happening, particularly when it comes to wars. You know, you think of the Iraq War, when the Bush administration was in power in the US 20 odd years ago now. You know, there was all this talk of like the clash of civilizations, and like this was like a new crusade of Christendom against the Islamic world, and we're going to bring freedom and democracy, you know, to the Middle East. And that was, so there was like this religious justification. George Bush was a very Christian man. All the evangelical Christians fell in behind him. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were wars that were justified and cheered on by evangelical Christianity. Wars with a shocking civilian toll, where the infrastructure of all of Iraq was destroyed, ultimately laying the groundwork for the rise of ISIS. And all of these horrors, millions of people displaced as refugees across the world because of the destabilizing of that entire region. But the Christians supported it because it was in the name of God and it was in the name of Jesus. So that somehow made it okay. But that's not how it works. Either unaliving non-combatants is wrong, unaliving innocent civilians, including children, is wrong, or it isn't. It's not right if you do it in God's name. It's just wrong. But you know, religious people will deceive themselves into thinking that there's circumstances where that sin is permissible because it's in God's name. And the most unspeakable sins are permissible if only they're done in God's name. And you know, the way that it gets justified is, well, you know, my side is right, my religion is right, and ultimately the only way that the world is going to be fixed is if everybody submits themselves to my religion. And whatever it takes to do that, whatever it takes to get to that point, is justified because of the final outcome, because far more people will suffer if our side doesn't have absolute victory. And this is the same justification that communists used when they were rising to power, and it was the reason why, like Christians, they've got such a staggering body count. It's because of that same kind of ideology. But again, this betrays a kind of a pride to think that one person can, or a group of people, know better than everybody else about what the whole world needs. You know, freedom and democracy are, in my opinion, just better forms of government than an autocracy or an authoritarian regime where people are censored for saying the wrong thing. But you can't impose freedom and democracy on other people. You can't go in and just bomb a place to smithereens and then impose a foreign form of government on top of that and say, now you have freedom and democracy. Freedom and democracy has to come about by the consent of the governed. It can only come about when the population, I would say an overwhelming majority of the population, actually want it and want that particular style of democracy. So it's not something that can be imposed from the outside. You know, but when people come along and they interfere and they tamper with other people's journey towards, you know, a more peaceful society, you know, all they're doing is messing things up. They're interfering with a naturally emerging process and ultimately making things worse. You know, the communists thought they knew better than everybody else about what the ideal society looks like. But how many more people have been unalived because of them than if they had just never attempted to radically reshape the world in the first place? So you can see how thinking that if only your side wins, whatever the cost, then everything will be better is a fallacy. Because when you start to think that, then you give yourself permission to do things that are worse than what would eventuate if things had just played out differently, because you consider the stakes to be so high with the success or failure of your particular belief system. So you can see how a religious veneer can be given to acts by a group of people who are an oppressor in order to try and justify their actions. But it works the other way as well, because, you know, with the advent of religions where martyrdom is a thing, quite often the victim complex becomes a way of justifying oneself as being more righteous than others. The fact that one is oppressed becomes something which makes one more righteous by virtue of that suffering, as we're all too familiar with in, you know, the age of wokeism. And so, but then when that happens, you're likewise, once you have that status, it becomes, in many cases, an excuse to commit awful acts against other people. If you can say, my people or my group have been oppressed by this other group of people for hundreds of years or thousands of years, you know, and now it's time for justice to get back at them and take back what is ours. You know, 99 times out of 100, when people that are tapping into that anger are talking about justice, what they're really talking about is revenge. Revenge through collective punishment on a group of people who aren't directly responsible for whatever historic evil has been perpetrated against this particular group of people. And so, you know, the cycle of inhumanity of one person against another only continues. And so, you know, the vicious cycle of maltreatment of one person against another only continues. As oppressed becomes oppressor and produces a new oppressed who becomes a new oppressor, and on it goes until there's not a single person left on earth. So that is the sobering reality of terrible acts being committed in the name of religion. And the major reasons why I think that it happens, leaving aside, you know, the fact that quite often there's socio-political or even economic factors, you know, the factor of irrationality. I think that, you know, nothing can happen in society without a justification, without the engines of soft power creating a narrative that allows that thing to be acceptable to the majority. And these are some of the ways that religious fanaticism can appeal to people's egos to make them believe that things that are really awful actually have a religious justification and are really good. And it's so dangerous because, you know, the person who doesn't believe in anything, who just minds their own business, you know, they might let really terrible things happen and remain silent, which is bad. But one thing to their credit is that they're not out there trying to interfere with other people's wills and interfere with other people's lives because they think that they have some kind of, a divinely mandated right to do that to other people. There are some people that are called to do great things, who receive a religious calling to change the world for the better, and that really is legitimate. It legitimately happens. It happened with Martin Luther King, for example. But, quite often that's just a delusion, and people are going out of their way to try and change the way that the world is in some radical way, but they're not making it better, they're making it worse, because what they're following is a form of egotism, and it's a form of worldliness and wickedness which simply superficially looks like something good. And it can get a level of support that it wouldn't get if it didn't have that veneer about it. And so that's why it's so dangerous. And that is why, particularly if you're following a spiritual path, if you're following a particular kind of religion, you need to be extra vigilant in making sure that you're not falling into this trap of dogmatism, of sectarianism, of believing in something which is a mockery of true religion. So always be discerning about that. I hope that the events of the world of late are not affecting you too negatively. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. Maybe it provided a bit of an explanation of some of the madness of the world at the moment. Leave your comments down below. If you have any, please like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel to support my work. Subscribe to my Odyssey account as well. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.